Hello, I'm Roy with StatBid, and welcome to the next episode of the e-commerce workshop series, where I get to chat and talk shop with folks that know more about specific topics than I do. And in my opinion, email is the most underutilized channel in digital marketing because it's so easy to get a little bit of the basics right and then fail to really follow through. And it's much easier to see immediate payoff from some of the least sophisticated approaches. And so I think that's been true for more than a decade. Email continues to be just a huge pile of opportunities for most e-commerce shops, and so that's why I'm excited to have Mike from Rejoiner on today. Mike, why don't you introduce yourself to the audience?
Yeah, stoked to be here. It's hard to believe this, but I've been doing one thing for the last 10 years, and that is building, growing, and optimizing the email channel for direct-to-consumer e-commerce brands. And so Rejoiner as an organization, we're an ESP, we're a software company, builds technology that handles all the different use cases that D2C brands need to execute on in the channel. And then we also pair that with a services group that helps our clients with execution, copywriting, design, template development. So it's a kind of a one-stop shop for everything a brand needs for email.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate you coming on and sharing some of your expertise with us. Why don't we bring up your deck and you can dive right in?
Cool. Yeah. So what I'm going to talk about today, like I said, I've been doing this for 10 years, and the topic that generates really the most anxiety, frustration, panic, and stress is deliverability. And what's interesting about deliverability is, although there's a lot of information out there, we still find that it's misunderstood by the most sophisticated brands. And I get emails like this probably once or twice a month. This is a brand doing probably 100 million in revenue or more, really at the sophisticated end of the spectrum in terms of the makeup of their team. This is a brand name we're probably all well aware of. And deliverability, despite all of these really high caliber folks in their marketing organization, is somewhat of a mystery. It's still somewhat opaque to them. And so what I want to talk about today is, if you find yourself in a situation where you're having deliverability challenges, what I want to share with you today is the framework. When I have these conversations with brands about challenges in this space, I take them through a framework that does three things. Helps them assess the situation that they're in. Where do the challenges lie, and how are we going to address those? We help them repair the damage, and then we help them set up a system to prevent deliverability issues in the future. But first, I think let's set the stage, right? Let's set the foundation and unpack a simple question, right? And the question is, what is good deliverability? What factors play into creating a situation where you can sustainably reach your customers via the email channel over the long term? And our perspective is that there are four components to great deliverability. The first one is IP reputation. This is the reputation of the underlying infrastructure that delivers your email. So this is typically controlled by your email service provider. These are the actual machines, the servers that deliver email to your customers. Sending domain is the second factor. This is specific to your brand, right? So this is the sending address that you use, that your customer sees when they open an email from you, and it's specific to you. Recipient engagement is the third dimension, and this is the ratio of positive engagement to negative engagement, right? There are good things that happen when people consume email, and there are bad things that happen when your customers consume email. And what ISPs or inbox service providers are looking at is the ratio of positive to negative over time. And then content is the fourth dimension. This is like the words and the images, the actual content that your customers are interacting with. And I highlighted two components of the four: sending domain and recipient engagement. For most of our customers in D2C, the vast majority of the folks that they send to are Gmail addresses. And so I started sending domain and recipient engagement. For most e-com companies, Gmail is what we're trying to optimize for. And those two, sending domain and recipient engagement, are what Gmail heavily weights over the other two factors. And so when we talk about recipient engagement, it's like, what are these good things and what are these bad things, right? How do we think about the ratio? And I like to describe it to folks as, think of it like debits and credits in a bank account, right? There are credits, which are things like opens, clicks, forwards, when your subscribers mark your emails as important, most importantly, when they reply to messages that you've sent. And then there are bad things that happen, right? When they ignore your messages, when they unsubscribe, when they complain, when they bounce, when they choose to set up a filter and skip the inbox. And so what ISPs are monitoring over time as you send and your volume increases is they're monitoring this ratio of positive to negative signal. And if you cross into thresholds that they deem to be unacceptable, that's when you start to have problems reaching your customers. And so once we've had that conversation, right, how much negative signal do we believe that we're generating? We do some analysis to look at historically how many negative outcomes are occurring. The next thing that we sort of check off is we look at how brands are structuring their sending domain, right? And most brands send like four kinds of email: transactional, promotional, triggered, and cold, right? So transactional is things like order confirmations, shipping confirmations. Promotional emails are things like, content, promotional sends, seasonal offers, things that, newsletters that are going out to their entire list. Triggered are things like cart abandonment, browse abandonment, new subscriber activation, first purchase welcome. Cold is obviously where they're doing cold outreach to, potentially influencers or wholesale partners, right? And with each of these four dimensions of send types, there are increasing levels of risk with each type that impact how you want to structure your sending domains. And so this is how we recommend typically that you structure these four buckets, right? So you have your transactional emails. We recommend sending those from your primary domain. So if your website is yourdomain.com or yourbrand.com, we recommend sending transactional from the primary because it poses the lowest risk, right? Not too many people are going to be complaining or unsubscribing from your order confirmations or your ship confirmations, your delivery notifications. And because of that, there's really no risk that they're going to interfere with your ability to send email from your primary domain. Just because most of those interactions are going to be positive. For promotional and triggered, we recommend sending those from an isolated subdomain specifically for those two send types. So it could be em.yourdomain.com or e.yourdomain.com, but we're trying to isolate those posts slightly more risk. Promotional and triggered sends, right? They're probably going to generate more negative outcomes than your transactional sends. And so keeping those isolated and keeping them together is generally a best practice. And then for cold outreach, we see this issue all the time where most brands will start doing cold outreach from their primary domain. And then this becomes really problematic because that is our highest risk send type. And what we recommend here is to actually split cold off into maybe a third, fourth, or even fifth subdomain. You could also argue that varying the from address or the name along with that sending domain is also something that can be helpful. But we definitely want to isolate cold separately from.
For that example with the sender name, is that due to behavioral differences on the part of the recipient, or do you think that is something in the platform level for uniqueness?
It's actually mostly for establishing reputation. And so when you're doing cold outreach, you're generally starting with very small, very targeted groups of customers, right? And certainly there can be behavioral differences where somebody may react differently to one name versus another. But it's actually from an ISP's perspective, it basically allows you to distribute the risk across a larger number of from addresses, that reputational risk, if you're changing the from name as well. So it's really a risk distribution strategy, just because cold outreach can be such a challenging thing to scale up. And so if you have a bank of from addresses that you're using, you can distribute that risk sort of more evenly.
Are the subdomains fairly well isolated from one another in terms of the risk, or is there still a contribution to the parent domain, kind of like there would be with IP reputation?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think nobody really knows algorithmically what's the pass through. So if you have multiple subdomains, what's the pass through of reputational risk from a subdomain to a primary domain? Situations where we've had issues with reputation on a primary, from a data perspective and a deliverability perspective, for most ISPs, it feels like you get a clean slate if you go to the subdomain. Now, at what rate reputation passes through to the primary, I don't think anybody really has a true answer to that question. But certainly starting fresh with a subdomain has been effective to help us alleviate some of these issues.
Cool.
All right. So the next thing we want to look at is authentication, right? And if I'm with email marketing, there are a whole bunch of 3-letter and 4-letter acronyms, right? For the purposes of authentication, I want to focus on 3 that are the most important. So sender policy framework, domain keys identified mail, and domain message authentication reporting. So that's SPF, DKIM, and DMARC. And I just want to talk quickly about what each of these things are, what they do, and just that you should generally be aware of how they work. And so SPF these are all DNS records, where basically you set up a record and your DNS for SPF specifically. And what it does is it tells an ISP that you've given permission to a third-party sender to send on behalf of your domain. So you're working with a third-party sender who is your ISP, who is sending email from a domain that you own. And SPF tells the ISP that you have given that permission and that the message has not been spoofed. In other words, a malicious party is not trying to use your domain to send email that appears to be from you, but isn't. And so SPF is a really important authentication protocol that basically tells the ISP, okay, this brand has given permission for this sender to send email using their domain. Domain keys identified mail, or DKIM, is a tool. It's a similar tool, also a DNS record that you'll set up on your sending domain. And what that does is it verifies that the content of your message, the words, the images, the content that your customer is going to interact with, it verifies that none of that content has been altered in transit. There are some situations where a malicious party could intercept an email message coming from your brand and alter it and do something malicious where they're trying to send a customer to somewhere they shouldn't. And DKIM, from an ISP's perspective, you have this set up, will verify that has not occurred, that the content you sent to the customer is the content that they'll be interacting with. And DMARC is a standard that basically allows you as a brand owner, a domain owner, to set a policy for what to do with messages that don't conform to SPF and DKIM to your standards. Basically allows you to set up a quarantine policy that says, okay, if Gmail processes an inbound message that does not conform to the standard that I've set for SPF, there are strict or relaxed interpretations of both of these authentication protocols. Basically, DMARC gives you the ability to tell Gmail what to do with it, what to do with the message. Do they quarantine it? Do they let it go through to the customer? DMARC provides a set of reporting standards so you can see how all of the emails sent from your sending domains are being interacted with at the ISP level. And so although SPF and DKIM, we view those as absolute requirements when you're sending email with a third party, DMARC can be more challenging to implement because a lot of brands, there's a third-party email being sent by probably many third-party providers on behalf of your domain. And so you have to be really careful about configuring those quarantine policies because you can sort of inadvertently quarantine messages that you want to get through. So DMARC is one to be more careful with, though there is emerging data that suggests having an established DMARC policy is actually really helpful from a deliverability standpoint, but it's one to be more careful with when you set it up. So once we've established, right, we've got a really good idea about authentication. We've set up our sending domains in a way that makes sense according to best practice. We've got a good understanding of any negative signals that are being generated. The next tool that we typically will start to work with at this point when we're still in the assessment phase here to determine like, okay, how bad is this deliverability problem?
I just wanted to highlight, just because the way the screenshot came out, that the green box here is labeled inbox, the yellow is tabs, and the red is spam, and finally the empty one at the end is missing. So just in case the thumbnail is too small to read, I wanted to share that first.
Yeah, thanks. And really what this visual is just trying to illustrate is this is a tool we use called a seed list. And when we're in this assessment phase and we're trying to figure out the severity of a deliverability issue, seed lists help us determine where in the inbox we are landing and if we have deliverability problems with specific ISPs. And here's how it works. We control inboxes with Gmail, Yahoo, Outlook, 50 other inbox providers. And what we do is we start to broadcast messages to our seed lists, so the inboxes that we control, and we can start to get a sense of how each individual ISP is inboxing our message. Are we going to tabs? Are we going to spam? Are we going to the primary tab? And that can help us pinpoint specific issues. Maybe we have a very specific issue with Outlook. Well, in order to address that issue with Outlook postmasters, we have to have that information. We have to have that data to know that our problem is ISP specific. And so seed lists, once we've verified the underlying infrastructure of how we send and that we have all these authentication protocols configured correctly, seed list is the next thing that we do to get a sense of at the most basic level where we're landing in the inbox. This can also be really helpful. Even if you're not trying to troubleshoot a deliverability issue, seed lists are great on an ongoing basis. Maybe you send to your seed list on a monthly or quarterly basis, and it just helps you sleep at night to know that, okay, I'm inboxing the way that we think we're inboxing across all of the different ISPs that your customers use. And then the next tool in our toolbox is address validation. Right. So now we have a really good understanding of, okay, if we send to our primary list, we know where we're inboxing. And what address validation does is it gives us the ability to programmatically look at all of the subscribers on our lists and determine whether or not those addresses are problematic. Right. And so there are a whole bunch of providers out there that offer this service where basically you upload your list to there's a service called Zero Bounce. Never Bounce is another one. And what they'll do is take your list and query against a massive database of known spam traps, addresses that are known to complain or report abuse, catch-all addresses like group aliases, things of that nature, invalid addresses that have syntax issues that you probably want to avoid. And so what these tools do is allow you to take your list and root out any addresses that could cause deliverability problems down the road. And so I'll sort of summarize. This screenshot is probably also a little small to see the column labels, but basically what it's doing is like saying, okay, you upload a list of 200,000 contacts, 93% of them come back as valid, 1% were invalid, and then it's filtering out catch-all spam traps, abuse emails, do not mail addresses, and unknowns. And so this type of validation is really helpful because much of this is available because of like these huge databases that these providers offer. And so, right off the top, you can remove problematic email addresses from your list without having to send to the entire list to find those folks.
Got a question for you.
Sure.
Caleb asks, are there cases in which it is better for an email reputation purposes for any non-transactional emails to go to the tabs or the promotions tab in Gmail? Is that something that might be a good thing in some cases, or is it too high a bar in terms of visibility?
So let me make sure I understand the question. So are there cases in which it is better for email reputation for any non-transactional emails to go to tabs or the promotions tab in Gmail? And I guess I'm not sure I completely understand the question. So transactional emails, regardless, will generally go to the primary tab. If it's a receipt or a shipping confirmation or something that, let's say Gmail deems to be of high importance to the user.
Mm-hmm.
And so much of Gmail's algorithm is personalized for that individual, right? That's the other wild card, is that if Gmail has historically seen an individual interact with email from your brand, transactional or not, there's a much higher likelihood that it will circumvent promotions and go to the primary tab. Obviously you want to be in primary, every time you send, but that's just not the reality. Most e-com brands are going to promotions, and we look at it like it's actually not a bad thing, right? Because you're aligning the expectations of the user. When they click into their promotions tab, they are expecting to consume promotions, which is not a bad thing, right? The intent is there. And also Gmail is doing some really interesting things where, with annotations, for example, where they're actually allowing brands to add, a little bit of extra content to an email message, and they're surfacing it in the promotions tab in a very prominent way. It's almost like a pay-per-click ad where they surface an offer, an image, a strong call to action. And if historically they've seen this individual user interact with your stuff, they'll surface your offer at the top of the promotions tab. Now it's only on mobile currently, but it will be eventually rolling over to the desktop version of Gmail as well.
Yeah, that sounds like it resembles at least the desktop version of the Gmail ads. Like you said, it resembles a PPC ad. The desktop version has one that basically matches that description.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And if they're giving brands ways to stand out based on the intent of the user because they've historically interacted with your content before, I think that's a good thing, right? So the promotions tab may become and is becoming a more dynamic, more dynamic aspect of the inbox, where maybe some more interactivity will be possible. Whereas in the primary tab, maybe they won't go there. It's the jury's out.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Thanks.
And Caleb, sorry, you had a follow-up here as well. To be in the primary tab no matter what, just not sure if there's logic behind Gmail or the inbox fires tabs when it comes to filtering email. Yeah, so I think I addressed that piece. So much of it is personalized to the individual user, and I think what's interesting and what we'll talk about here in a second is there is an opportunity to train the algorithm to do more of what you want. So we'll talk about that here in a second. Cool. All right. So the next piece, we want to understand list health. Obviously, we've gone through this exercise where we're programmatically removing problematic addresses from our list. That's going to improve list health. But there's another dimension of list health that we want to address, and that is the recency of positive interaction. Right. So we have this big list of hundreds of thousands of customers. We want to break that list out into cohorts to understand who are our recent engagers. And so we typically break out into 4 cohorts: folks who have opened or clicked in the last 30 days, folks who have opened or clicked in the last 60, last 90. Then we take everybody else and we put them in a bucket of folks who have not interacted in the last 90 days. This is going to become important for 2 slides here in a second that we're going to touch on. For warming up new infrastructure, you want to warm up new infrastructure with your engaged customers first. And also, we just want to get a sense of what percentage of our list is actually active, because that will factor into something we'll talk about here in a second, which is sunsetting policy, which is when do we decide to proactively remove customers from our lists because they're not engaging. So this is an exercise we want to go through, just to have a good understanding of, okay, what percentage of our list that we're sending to is interacting on a regular, consistent, and recent basis. And then this is going to help us with 2 initiatives here that we're going to talk about in a second. And the next thing we want to audit, the most basic level, how hard is it to unsubscribe? You would be amazed some situations we find ourselves in where a brand is still using an unsubscribe and opt-out process where, I mean, we've all been through this as consumers, right? Where you click unsubscribe and maybe you have to check 6 boxes and enter your email address again, and then you have to confirm, and it takes 5 steps, and it's a very convoluted process. And what this does, I refer to this as unsubscribe rage or opt-out rage. If the intent of a user is to unsubscribe from your stuff, and you make it difficult to do that, you have about 7 seconds before that customer is going to say, forget this, I'm just going to complain. Which, if your list is large enough, that can create a lot of deliverability problems, right? Because
this is the main example when I hear the term dark pattern in user interface design. This is the one that comes to mind for me first.
It's completely a dark pattern, like intentional or not. I mean, because I know in some cases it is not intentional. But this is one thing that we always audit, because it doesn't have to be that way, right? What we recommend is a 1-click unsubscribe. So the end user clicks the unsubscribe link, they immediately get a confirmation. There's no further action required. Display a visual, preferably green, with very clear language that says, you have unsubscribed successfully. You will not receive any further emails from us. There, done. No opportunity for any confusion or frustration. Gmail specifically has also introduced some interesting updates and changes here in this area, in that there is basically a tag you can add to the header of an outgoing message that will enable Gmail to display 1-click unsubscribes basically in the inbox, the top of your message. So instead of making the user scroll to the bottom of your email to find the unsubscribe link, they can do it directly from their Gmail inbox. And so this is sort of along the same lines, whether it's 1-click or not. It does give Gmail users a very efficient path to unsubscribe, and they don't have to leave their inbox, which is the nice thing. Obviously, you want to process unsubscribes instantly. If not, within 24 hours, this idea that you can, wait 2 weeks to process an unsubscribe just isn't the case anymore. And the one that really gets me, you don't need to send a confirmation email that a customer has unsubscribed. They don't want to hear from you anymore. They don't want more email from you, and you don't need to confirm. It's still amazing to me how many companies still send those confirmation emails. Cool. All right. Let's talk about warm-ups next. So, we're getting there, right? We're in the, really this addressing unsubscribe friction is really the last step in the assessment phase, right? So we've gone through all of these indicators that give us a better idea about why deliverability issues are happening. And hopefully we've been able to address those. And so from here, we move into the assessment phase, right? And let's assume that as a result of as a result of our audit, we're setting up a new sending domain that is going to be mainly used for promotional and triggered sends. It's very important that with a new subdomain, a new sending domain, that you conservatively warm up or ramp up the volume of messages over, depending on your list size. It usually takes basically 1 to 2 weeks. And there are a couple of dimensions of a warm up that are helpful to be aware of. So what we typically do is we'll take a list and we'll actually break it out by ISP. So we'll take all the addresses on a list, we'll break them down into AOL addresses, Yahoo addresses, Hotmail addresses, Gmail addresses, and we'll actually run our warm up by ISP. And what we're trying to do is double our send volume to each ISP by day. So on day 1, we'll send 100 messages to Gmail addresses. Day 2, we'll send 200, 400, 800, et cetera, up to a target volume. We also throttle hourly volume by ISP. And what we're trying to avoid here, what a warm-up helps us do, is to get in front of issues where, let's say, for some reason we have a bunch of really low quality Yahoo addresses on our list. Slowly ramping up volume like this allows us to conservatively observe the negative signal, right, from that conversation, positive and negative signal. It allows us to conservatively observe all the negative things that are happening. So maybe we have a bounce rate that's like above an acceptable threshold for Yahoo. And we need to address that. This warm-up allows us to do this in a very controlled environment. Also from an ISP's perspective, it allows us to slowly ramp up and build reputation so that they see this new subdomain as having positive sending practices. Now, the mistake some folks typically make is they'll go out to everybody on the list all at once with no visibility into performance at the ISP level. And 10% of your list bounces, and that creates a deliverability problem right out of the gate because you've generated too much negative signal in too short a time period. And so this is, another key part of this is you can also mitigate your risk even further remember we did the 30, 60, 90 engagement analysis. You can start with your low risk folks. So your recent engagers, ramp up with those guys first. So those guys pose very little risk from a reputation and deliverability perspective because that they're interacting with your stuff regularly already. So warm-ups, the way to think about them is to conservatively ramp, especially in a case where you're using a new subdomain. If you're migrating ESPs and the underlying infrastructure is changing, so you have new sending IPs, also a really good opportunity to warm up. But just taking a conservative approach to scaling up to your full target volume can be really helpful to surface issues.
So the goal is kind of twofold by the sound of it. One, you're trying to reassure these inbox domains that you're not a shady operator, and having 100,000 bounces and unsubscribes in your first blast would be a huge red flag for them. But you're also taking your risks with this new domain when the stakes are the lowest by fixing things with a much smaller list size and sending size out of the gates, and in addition to the obvious throttling which plays into both of those, I suppose.
Exactly right. Yeah.
Okay.
And then further minimizing your risk by being aware of subscribers you already have who are consistent and recent engagers, and you basically seed positive engagement with those folks first. Yep, you got it. And I talk about seeding positive reputation. Oh boy, that's a bad typo in that header. Oops. There's also something you can do. I think if there's one slide to take away from this presentation, it's this one. We were talking about being able to train Gmail's algorithm and ISP's algorithms in terms of what they should do with your messages. And one tactic that we've seen to be really effective in this area is during your warm up, you can basically recruit a group of friendly addresses for specific ISPs and ask them to seed those positive interactions out of the gate. So ask 10 or 20 friends on Gmail to open a message from you, mark it as important, forward it to a friend. Most importantly, ask them to reply. And initially, when you're warming up a new subdomain, these types of positive interactions, replies specifically, right? Because I think what a lot of marketers forget is email is designed to be a two-way medium. And most folks are very focused on the promotional side and the revenue generation opportunities that it presents. However, one of the best indicators as to whether or not your subscribers actually want what you're sending them is if an ISP observes a two-way exchange reply. And so in situations where you're trying to recover from a deliverability mistake or you have a challenge, thinking about your email program, obviously you can see this positive engagement with a small number of people, but also think about ways that you can encourage replies from your subscribers when you are doing promotional sends. Ask questions. Instead of having a content block that says email support at brandxyz.com, ask them to just hit reply if they have a question. That's why it's so important to send from a monitored inbox as well, so you can just have customers reply to your messages.
This is a whole nother reason to lean against no reply addresses. I always, whenever I see a no reply from a brand of any size and under any circumstances, I'm always like, this is a missed opportunity and it's shameful. And so if you're already using a no reply for something like transactional messaging, this is a great example of yet another reason to consider, having a different reply to or send from address for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it becomes a way to continue the conversation with the customer who they may need support. They may need a little extra reassurance to complete a purchase. They may have a question about an offer, right? Not only does this have enormous benefit from a reputation perspective, it also generates significant amount of qualitative feedback. That's really like, it's like gold, right? You can take these responses and the voice of the customer, the language the customer is using, and integrate that into your product detail pages. Build policies around the questions that people have using their words. And so it becomes this really valuable source of voice of customer data as well. Cool. All right. So next, let's talk about double opt-in. So when customers are joining your list, right, there are two ways that they can join: single and double opt-in. So single opt-in is a situation where a prospect or a subscriber is on your site, they enter their email address for something, and they are immediately added to your primary list. They will start receiving your promotional messaging, triggered sends, so on and so forth immediately. Double opt-in is where somebody joins the list, and then you may send a follow-up confirmation email that asks the customer to confirm that in fact they did opt in and they do want to continue to receive marketing promotional messages from you. We actually don't recommend double opt-in, with the exception of one very specific case. We don't recommend that most D2C brands employ double opt-in for this reason. Typically, only about 25% or less of subscribers who are asked to confirm a subscription will actually do so. And so we find that the trade-off there, obviously, when you use double opt-in, you're getting a lower number of much more qualified people joining the list. But in fact, it hampers the growth of your list by so much that in fact it is really not worth it in the long run. We'll try to seed out low quality, filter out low quality addresses in another way. So we don't recommend it for D2C brands. I have yet in italics here because there may come a time in the near future where There's some federal legislation that changes. We're already seeing this in some U.S. states where basically double opt-in is not a requirement. However, it could be if privacy legislation evolves at the federal level. It's already starting at the state level with CCPA in California. That doesn't require opt-in, but it's getting pretty close. And there's some states that look like they're going to be rolling out some much more restrictive policies around how and when you can email folks.
On that note, if it does come down to that, or if you're in a situation where you do need it for repair, as you indicate on the slide here, yeah. Do you have to treat that as a transactional email, or could you use, say, part of a promotion to encourage that second step?
It definitely doesn't have to be a transactional email. I think the key is that, with GDPR in Europe, the language basically is it needs to be an auditable record of how and where and when that double opt-in, that consent was provided. And so whether that comes via click-through of another email or whether it comes via some other means, I don't think it matters. How it was captured, just that you're capturing an auditable record of when.
Okay, so then basically the use case I'm imagining is if you have, say, a $5 coupon that you're using as your incentive to join the list, and then redemption is the act of clicking on that link. I would frame it and say exactly this is both to confirm that you wanted to join the list and to apply the coupon to your cart, continue shopping kind of workflow. Sure. It's just anytime a new hurdle comes up, there might be opportunities from another strategy in the toolbox to try and get over it.
Yeah, I think it comes down to the language that we use is if consent is being freely and willingly provided, right? So it's clear to the end user what they're doing, and they are checking a box that is opt-in. The box is not pre-checked, and there's clear language that goes along with that checkbox. I think that's equally as effective. Yeah. And so, to Roy's point, right, there is a more strategic use for double opt-in, and that is if you are addressing a challenge with deliverability or you're recovering from a mistake. We do recommend using double opt-in for maybe more of a time box way, where for a period of time you are only letting the most qualified, the highest quality, the most engaged subscribers onto the list, just because you want to make sure that while you're in this repair phase, the ratio of positive to negative signal remains as high as it possibly could be.
Right.
And so that's the situation to employ it. And so let's talk about sunsetting policy next. Sunsetting policy at a high level is the decision you make as a brand as to when do we stop sending to people who are not enhancing our reputation. And this is always, sort of a touchy topic, right? Because in many cases, we've paid to acquire traffic. Thus, we've paid to acquire a new subscriber. And if that subscriber has not been monetized in a way that is favorable to the business, removing them from our list seems like a big opportunity loss, right? So it's always a sensitive conversation. We look at it like this as a baseline. If a customer has been on your list for 180 days and they've received email, promotional, triggered, whatever it may be, during that 100-day, 80-day period, if they've experienced your email channel as you would want them to during that cycle, and they have not engaged, no open, no click, we recommend that as a starting point to sunsetting them. And you don't need to delete them from your ESP. You don't need to purge their data. Basically, you're just going to segment them out of your regular email communication, because we look at it like, if you're sending to someone who is ignoring what you have to say, that is not viewed favorably by ISPs, right? That's a negative signal. If you continue to send to someone week in and week out, and they appear to not care about the content that you're sending them, that is not enhancing your reputation. And in fact, it's detracting over the long term, especially as you get into higher numbers in your list scales. 180 days is pretty, you think of that, it's like, okay, 3 months, that's pretty aggressive, right? And so there's some caveats here as well.
6, but yeah.
6 months, yeah. There's some caveats, right? It's always dependent on your buying cycle, right? There are some brands that, they may do 95% of their business in Q4, right? So if a customer is ignoring email for 6 or 8 months, that's not an unusual occurrence. So buying cycle definitely factors in.
Yeah, I was as many folks who are watching today probably know, I used to be in pool supplies, and we would definitely see one big purchase a year from a cohort of folks. And so when we were doing our filters for looking for those disengaged groups, we would keep an eye out for that exception to that rule, because we knew we had some existing pattern. But if without the seasonality of pool supplies, or the seasonality of Q4 heavy site like you're describing, you need to start with a benchmark somewhere, and 180 days is more than generous for. And then your options are either, if they're not listening, I can either stop talking to them or shout louder. And obviously the latter doesn't really make a lot of sense if you put yourself in your customers, your recipients' shoes.
Yeah. And I'll clarify, 180 days at 6 months is a starting point. There is data to suggest that Gmail specifically starts to penalize you at 90 days, at 3 months.
Got it.
And so, it's really about just dialing it, what makes sense from a business perspective and a buying cycle perspective. But that's, really what we're talking about is 3 to 6 months of inactivity. Now, like I said, this is not a situation where inactive folks have to be purged and they're never going to hear from us again. What we recommend is that periodically, maybe for your most compelling offers or your product launches, or just something that you really want to get out there to a larger audience, rotate in these non-engagers for compelling moments that you want them to know about. And basically we use in our platform, we use like 2 segments to identify inactives, to identify actives. Going out to those folks who are inactive creates an opportunity to drive engagement, right? An open or click, and then they flow back into the active segments. You basically can wake up a subscriber who hasn't engaged historically.
And you can use that same segment post facto to evaluate how effective that allegedly, large and compelling offer actually was among them. So,
exactly right. Yeah.
If you reached 0 of that, 10,000 that you were trying to lure back in, then compelling isn't quite the word that offer had earned.
Exactly. Or we're recognizing that in fact, the definition of an active, we're too late. Like there's no chance to save these folks. So that's the other, sort of interesting learning that can come out of it. Okay. I think Shiloh's got a question here. Let's see.
Got it up on the screen.
Yeah. You want me to read this?
I can read it for you. Cool. When you onboard a new client, do you start this process from scratch with fresh subdomains, or do you try and assess the reputation first to determine if you can leverage the existing subdomains?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's completely situational. In some cases, we're starting from scratch because best practices haven't been employed up to that point. In other cases, an existing sender who's got lots of history and a strong portfolio of subdomains, we can just kind of roll into one of the pre-existing ones. I would say most of the time we're starting from scratch. And so this warm up process, getting authentication configured, everything that we've talked about here today, this is all part of the onboarding process.
So if it ain't broke, don't fix it, but they're onboarding for a reason.
Yeah, exactly. Typically.
Got it.
Yep. Cool. All right. So, now we're in the maintain phase, right? We are sunsetting inactives. So I want to talk about a couple of mistakes that I see get made quite frequently. And when it comes to list health, even double opt-in, right, is designed to increase the quality of the subscriber that we're adding to the list. And one mistake that I see a lot of D2C comms make is with co-marketing. And so they get into a situation with a group of brands or potentially one of these co-marketing partnerships that are doing sort of contest or promotion driven roll-ups with a number of brands that are designed to capture an enormous amount of email subscribers because they're opting in for contests. And the tendency that we see is like you participate in one of these promotions, and then really what the contest provider is doing is then taking all of the opt-ins and giving them to all of the brands that participated. And what we've seen time after time after time is that the brand will then roll these subscribers into their primary list. And in almost every case, out of the gate, 10% of those lists will bounce, or, some very unhealthy percentage will unsubscribe or complain. And so what we recommend with co-marketing and subscribers acquired via co-marketing is that you really proceed with caution, and you can actually adopt like the same methodology we were talking about with Warmups to conservatively ramp up volume with the lists that you're getting from co-marketing practices. And don't add these folks to your primary list right out of the gate. We recommend just take engagers. I mean, if you want to be more conservative, just with clickers, people who click through, and add those folks to your list, because time after time after time, we just see these lists creating so many problems for the brands that we work with. And there's some very simple, straightforward things that you can do, whether it's warming up or validating. It's the same. You can apply the same exact process that we did for our primary list to these lists of acquired via these folks acquired via co-marketing. And much more conservative approach is typically necessary to avoid problems here.
Do you see a slightly higher number of spam traps included in those? Because if I were Gmail, that's the kind of place where I would be trying to get those spam traps included.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Spam traps are spam traps because what the ISPs are trying to do is have an inbox that obviously it's somewhat secretive into they take over an inactive inbox and turn it into a spam trap. So we can only measure how many traps we're hitting with a certain degree of accuracy.
Got it.
But I would imagine you're exactly right that ISPs see these types of promotions as a great place to identify senders who are not using best practices. And that would not surprise me. Cool. All right. So let's talk about ongoing monitoring. So let's assume we've established our infrastructure. We've warmed up our new sending domains according to best practices. We've rooted out bad addresses using validation. We've done all the things that we need to do to get to a point where we're able to inbox reliably and sustainably and generate positive interaction with a group of customers who want our stuff, right? It's like, so then the next question becomes, how do we monitor our reputation over time? And this screenshot, which is probably difficult to see, is of Google Postmaster tools. So Google, and Gmail specifically, does not report things like complaints and unsubscribes and problematic events that occur when you send email to Gmail users publicly back to ESPs like Rejoiner. So when you see the complaint rates and the negative signal that's being generated in your ESP, it actually doesn't include Gmail users. Because what Gmail does is essentially they anonymize the data and they expose it only through a monitoring tool called Postmaster tools.
Right, because it'd be too easy to game the system otherwise. We run into similar kind of information security issues on the ad side.
Yeah, exactly right. And now the same is true. Verizon, which owns AOL and a couple of other inboxes, the same is true for Verizon-owned ISPs.
Mm-hmm.
And so it becomes critical that on a regular basis, I mean, to set up Postmaster tools, it's really straightforward. It's just another DNS record, just like those authentication protocols. Postmaster tools will give you feedback on your domain reputation, your IP reputation, so the underlying infrastructure delivering your mail. And you can also add headers for the Gmail feedback loop, which will, in an anonymous fashion, give you feedback on specific messages that are causing problems. And so for most brands, like Gmail is the leading indicator of success. It's also the most sophisticated from a spam filtering perspective.
Mm-hmm.
If you're doing well in Gmail, chances are you're doing well with the other inbox providers. And so if there's one monitoring tool to set up, it's this one, and to monitor it regularly. So definitely a key part of staying healthy over the long term is to monitor Postmaster tools.
Got it.
And the last point I want to make here, a lot of this is rooted in content strategy, right? And it comes down to, do the people you send to, do they want what you are sending? Do they care, right? There are all sorts of tactical things that we've talked about that can help you improve the situation. The technical foundation is, of course, necessary. But over the long term, what matters is that people continue to care. Yeah. I think a lot of email marketers miss this, especially the ones that become more addicted to promotional messaging and discounts, where over time, if that's the only message, you will get tuned out. People will stop caring. And so content strategy, you could we could have a whole other conversation about this, but what it comes down to is thinking about ways in which you can create value or positive moments in the life of the subscriber that you send to. And it's much more like thinking of like a publisher than a promoter.
Right.
It's, I like the analogy, if your brand published a magazine, what would it look like? What content would you curate?
Yeah, and in search, both paid and SEO, the cliche that we have is be the most relevant result. Like that's the first answer to any question. How do I optimize this or that? It's just be the most relevant result. The rest of it's technical details, and this is philosophically aligned to that same sort of approach. Yeah,
and it's it's not. This is not a difficult concept to grasp. However, so many email marketers make this mistake. Where it's about promotion first versus value first. What does the subscriber want? And, essentially what you're doing when you think like a publisher and you're creating content that's valuable in the life of the subscriber, right? Because the fact of the matter is that 99.99% of the people that you send to on a daily basis are not ready to transact, not ready to buy. But what you're doing is carving out this, it could be only a 1 or 2 second place in their day where they say to themselves, that was pretty cool. Like I got value out of that, even if it was just a visual or, some kind of interesting resource that you curated. They say, you know what? The next time these guys send, and even if it's subconscious, they'll say, I'm going to open next time, right? You're earning the opportunity to send to them again. And maybe that's when they'll be ready to transact. But it's about doing that over and over and over and over again. And that's how to build the channel sustainably. Awesome.
Well, thanks so much. We will pull up one more thing. I just wanted to share with everyone that we have this series is continuing for as long as people keep being willing to chat with us, frankly. Next up, we have Rand Fishkin. Many of you may know him from his days at Moz.com. He'll be joining us talking about SparkDoor and how to expand audience targeting. Then we also have Hussein, who's our friend from Markalytics, to discuss some of the implications of the shifting perspective and legislation on privacy. And then Phil will be talking about television. And as somebody who's very much used to direct response and digital marketing channels, that is way out of my comfort zone. So I'm definitely looking forward to that as well. But in that same vein, thank you so much, Mike. It's awesome. Always a pleasure to get to pick your brain.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
All right. Have a great day, everyone.